My parents gave my sister $125,000 for her wedding and told me, "You don't deserve any help." So I cut all contact and continued with my life. 3 years later, my sister passed by my $2.5 million house and called my mother crying, "Why does she have that?" You know how some families look absolutely flawless from the outside? The kind of family that sends out glossy holiday cards where everyone is wearing matching cashmere sweaters and smiling like they do not have a single problem in the world. That was my family. I grew up in a very comfortable, middle-class neighborhood in Boston. My father was a highly respected orthopedic surgeon at Massachusetts General Hospital, and my mother was a tenured English professor at Boston University. We lived in this gorgeous, sprawling colonial house with a perfectly manicured lawn, the kind of home that made people slow down their cars just to admire it. But living inside that house was a completely different story. Behind those heavy oak doors and the polished mahogany furniture, there was an unspoken hierarchy, a clear dividing line that defined every single day of my childhood. My name is Hazel, and I am 28 years old. I have an older sister named Beatrice, who is 3 years older than me. From the moment I was old enough to understand human interaction, I knew that Beatrice was the golden child. It was not just a feeling, it was a daily reality. Beatrice was academically gifted, naturally graceful, and she knew exactly how to play the game to get my parents' approval. She looked exactly like my mother, with the same flowing honey blonde hair and bright blue eyes. I, on the other hand, took after my father with dark hair and a much quieter, more observant demeanor. I remember sitting at our massive dining room table when I was maybe 10 years old. The grandfather clock in the hallway would tick steadily. Beatrice would bring home a straight-A report card, and my parents would treat it like she had just won a Nobel Prize. They would buy her expensive gifts, take her out to fancy dinners, and beam with pride. When I brought home my own excellent grades, my mother would barely glance at the paper before telling me to make sure my room was clean. At my grandfather's funeral, Beatrice was pushed to the front to speak and represent the family, while I was told to sit in the back row and just keep quiet. It was a constant, exhausting reminder that I was the spare, the afterthought. I learned very early on to just stay out of the way and accept the breadcrumbs of affection they tossed in my direction. I stopped trying to compete because the game was rigged from the start. The favoritism became painfully obvious when it involved money. When Beatrice reached high school age, my parents sat her down and excitedly announced they were enrolling her in Phillips Academy, an elite private school. The tuition was $45,000 a year. They did not even blink at the cost. My father told her it was an investment in her brilliant future and that it would set her up with all the right connections. I remember watching her try on her crisp new uniform, my mother fussing over her collar, telling her how sophisticated she looked. 2 years later, it was my turn to go to high school. I had spent months researching private schools, hoping I would get the same opportunity. Instead, my parents called me into the living room. My mother crossed her arms and used her professional, lecturing voice. She told me that tuition had become far too expensive and they were enrolling me in the local public school. "We need to be practical about finances," my mother explained, not looking me in the eye. "Besides, you have always been more independent than your sister." That independence was not a personality trait I chose, it was a survival mechanism because they never guided me. The absolute turning point for me, the moment I realized just how deep the divide went, was my 16th birthday. When Beatrice turned 16, she woke up to a brand new Honda Civic parked in our driveway. It had a massive red bow on the hood. My parents stood there with a camera, capturing her tears of joy. They took her out for a special dinner to celebrate. My father handed her the keys and said, "You have proven yourself responsible. We are so proud of you." I remember my own 16th birthday vividly. I woke up with a knot of anticipation in my stomach. I walked outside, looking at the driveway. It was empty. I walked back inside, confused, and found my parents drinking coffee. They casually suggested that if I wanted a vehicle, I should start looking for a part-time job to save up. I did not cry in front of them. I went to my room, shut the door, and stared at the wall until my vision blurred. The next week, I got a job at a local coffee shop. I spent my weekends and entire summers coming home smelling like roasted beans and stale milk. My feet would ache so badly I could barely walk up the stairs. After months of grueling work, I scraped together enough cash to buy a 10-year-old Toyota. The brakes squeaked constantly, and the air conditioning was broken. When I proudly showed it to my father, he did not congratulate me. He just looked at the rusty bumper and said, "This will teach you the value of hard work." When it came time for college, the script remained exactly the same. Beatrice was sent off to Northwestern University, with my parents happily covering every single expense. They paid her tuition, rented her a beautiful off-campus apartment, and gave her a generous monthly allowance so she would not have to stress about a job. She even got a trip to Europe as a graduation reward. When my senior year rolled around, I sat at the kitchen table with university brochures. I asked about the college fund they had supposedly started when I was a baby. My mother just sighed heavily. "We have already spent so much on education," she said, tapping her pen against the table. "Student loans will teach you fiscal responsibility. Everyone has debt these days." I had secured a partial scholarship to Boston University, but it was not enough. I had to take out massive student loans just to cover the rest. While Beatrice was studying business administration because my father told her to, I decided to pursue marketing. I actually had a passion for it. My parents hated my choice. During one particularly tense holiday dinner, my father did not even bother to lower his voice. He looked right at me across the turkey and the mashed potatoes and said, "Marketing is for people who could not get into better programs." I felt a hot flash crawl up my neck, but I bit my tongue. I worked 20 hours a week at the campus bookstore, taking a full course load, and I made the dean's list every single semester. Then, during my junior year, everything changed. I met Calvin. Calvin was studying computer engineering and working in the University Information Technology department to pay his way through school. We met in the library on a rainy Tuesday. He was carrying a stack of heavy textbooks, wearing a faded jacket, and he had the kindest, most tired smile I had ever seen. His parents were school teachers. They loved him dearly, but they had been very honest that they simply could not afford to finance his education. Instead of being bitter, Calvin worked with incredible determination. We connected instantly over our shared struggles. We would stay in the library until the security guards kicked us out at closing time. We shared cheap ramen noodles in my tiny dorm room, doing our laundry together on Sunday nights, talking endlessly about building a life where we did not have to rely on anyone else. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen. After graduation, the contrast between Beatrice and me only grew sharper. Beatrice moved back into our parents' house for a full year. She lived rent-free, ate their food, and job-searched at her absolute leisure. Meanwhile, Calvin and I were thrilled when we both negotiated a decent starting salary at our first real jobs. I got a position at a digital marketing agency, and Calvin joined a software development firm. We could not afford a lawyer to look over our first apartment lease, so we just prayed it was standard and signed the papers. We moved in together immediately to save on rent. We tracked every single penny on a massive spreadsheet, carefully budgeting our groceries, our utility bills, and aggressively paying down those heavy student loans. 3 years after graduation, Calvin and I took a weekend trip to hike the White Mountains. It was late autumn, the air was crisp, and the leaves were turning brilliant shades of orange and red. We were sweating, out of breath, and my hair was a messy knot. When we reached the summit, overlooking miles of forest, Calvin turned to me. He did not have an elaborate speech or a hidden photographer. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was his grandmother's ring, a simple gold band with a modest diamond. "I want to build the rest of my life with you," he said, his voice steady and full of warmth. I said yes before he even finished asking. The ring meant more to me than any massive rock ever could because of the history and the pure love behind it. We started talking about wedding plans that same night in our cheap motel room. We do not need anything fancy, I told Calvin, lying on the uncomfortable mattress. Just something small and meaningful with the people who really care about us. We set a strict budget of $15,000. That amount represented months and months of skipping dinners out and saving every spare dollar we had. We planned to hold the ceremony in a beautiful local public park, with a reception at our favorite cozy neighborhood Italian restaurant. There would be no towering floral centerpieces, no designer dresses, just a sincere celebration of us. I was so incredibly happy. I thought nothing could ruin that feeling. That was our quiet, happy plan until Beatrice dropped her bomb on the family. She announced she was engaged to Desmond. Desmond was the son of one of my father's senior partners at the hospital. He was exactly the kind of guy you picture when you hear the words trust fund. He had never worked a hard day in his life. He loved to casually mention his future inheritance whenever someone brought up the topic of work or money. But he came from the right pedigree, with the right country club memberships, and my parents were absolutely ecstatic about the match. The evening Beatrice announced it, my parents threw a massive, impromptu celebration at their house. They hired expensive catering with only a few hours' notice, cracked open bottles of vintage champagne, and invited all their wealthy friends. I found out about it through a cold text message from my mother, "Your sister is engaged. Dinner at 7 o'clock. Try to be on time." It felt like a slap in the face. Calvin and I arrived right on time. The house was already packed. The smell of roasted meats and expensive perfume hung in the air. Everyone was crowding around Beatrice, gasping at the enormous, flashy diamond on her finger. Desmond was standing by the fireplace, holding a drink, loudly bragging to everyone about how he proposed at a 5-star luxury resort in the Maldives. My mother was fluttering around them like a frantic moth drawn to a flame, and my father kept clapping Desmond on the shoulder, treating him like the son he always wanted. During dinner, my mother tapped her glass. "We are so thrilled to welcome Desmond to the family," she announced, beaming. "And of course, we want to give them the wedding they deserve." My father stood up and raised his glass high. "Which is why your mother and I have decided to give Beatrice and Desmond $125,000 toward their wedding expenses." The entire room erupted in gasps and applause. Beatrice squealed loudly and rushed to hug our parents. I sat frozen in my chair. I felt Calvin tense up beside me, his jaw clenching, but I reached under the heavy tablecloth and squeezed his hand tight. Later that night, as people were leaving, Beatrice pulled me into the kitchen to show me her wedding Pinterest board on her phone. "I am thinking about a destination wedding in Napa Valley," she gushed, swiping through pictures of elaborate tents and thousands of white roses. 200 guests minimum. A live band. "Oh, and you will be one of my bridesmaids, of course. Not maid of honor, though. That is going to be my college roommate." I forced a smile and nodded, pushing down the familiar sting of being pushed aside. "That sounds beautiful, Beatrice. Calvin and I are planning something small, but we are really excited, too." She blinked at me, her smile dropping slightly. "Oh. When are you thinking about having it?" "In about 6 months," I said. "At the local park. Just close friends and family." "Outdoors?" She looked genuinely horrified, like I had just told her I was getting married in a dumpster. "What if it rains?" "We want to keep it intimate," I explained, trying to keep my voice steady. "And we are working with what we can afford." She glanced out into the living room where our parents were laughing with Desmond. "Well, I am sure Mom and Dad will help you too," she said carelessly, though her tone sounded completely unconvinced. But her words planted a tiny, foolish seed of hope in my chest. Maybe they would. Not the massive sum they gave her, but maybe just a little something to show they cared. With that tiny sliver of hope, Calvin and I decided to speak to them directly. I called my mother and asked if we could come over on Sunday evening to discuss our wedding plans. There was a long, uncomfortable pause on the phone before she finally agreed. When we walked into their house on Sunday, the atmosphere was completely different from Beatrice's party. It was dead silent. There was no catering, no champagne. My mother had thrown together a basic lasagna, and my father was sitting in the living room watching television, barely acknowledging us until dinner was served. We sat at the dining table. The silence was so thick you could cut it with a knife. We made agonizing small talk about the weather and traffic. They deliberately avoided asking anything about the wedding. Finally, as my mother started pouring coffee, my heart began pounding in my chest. I took a deep breath. "So, Calvin and I have been finalizing our wedding plans," I began, my hands shaking slightly in my lap. "Nothing elaborate, just a small ceremony at the park and a reception at the Italian place down the street. We have been saving hard, but it is still going to be tight with our student loans and our rent." My parents exchanged a long, cold look. My father set his fork down sharply. "And what exactly are you expecting from us?" he demanded, his voice instantly putting me on trial. Calvin sat up straighter. "We are not expecting anything," he said, always polite but firm. "But Hazel thought it would be nice to discuss if you might want to contribute in some small way, as is traditional in many families." My mother set her coffee cup down with a loud clink. She looked at Calvin like he was a stray dog that had wandered into her spotless kitchen. "Traditional is for traditional couples," my mother sneered. "Couples who follow the proper order of things." A colleague of mine was battling for custody of her kids at the time, and it just reminded me how messy and cruel families could be when they wanted to hurt you. "What is that supposed to mean?" I asked, feeling a cold chill spread through my entire body. My father leaned forward, clasping his hands together on the table. "It means, Hazel, that your sister has always made choices that align with our family values. She attended the right schools, pursued a respectable career, and is marrying into a family that will enhance her social standing." My mother chimed in, her voice dripping with venom. "While you have consistently chosen to do things your own way. You rejected our advice about college. You picked a career in marketing, of all things, and now you are planning to marry." She gestured vaguely at Calvin. "A software engineer," Calvin stated, his voice incredibly steady despite the blatant disrespect. "Someone we barely know," my father interrupted loudly. "Someone from a background that frankly does not match our family's social circle." I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. "Calvin is brilliant, kind, and hardworking. His parents are educators. What exactly is wrong with his background?" "There is nothing wrong with being a school teacher," my mother said in a tone that proved she believed the exact opposite. "But Beatrice is making a match that secures her future. Desmond's family has resources." "So this is just about money?" I asked, my voice cracking. "It is about choices," my father said firmly, staring right through me. "And the simple fact is, Hazel, that you do not deserve the same help Beatrice does. You have not earned it." The words hit me like physical blows. "You do not deserve it. You have not earned it." "What would I have needed to do to deserve your support?" I whispered, tears finally spilling over my eyelashes. "Marry someone rich? Be someone other than who I am? What matters," my father said with absolute, chilling coldness, "is that we are giving your sister money because she deserves it. We will attend your wedding as guests, but do not expect financial support. You made your independent choices. Now live with them." As Calvin grabbed my hand and we stood up to leave, my mother delivered the final, crushing blow. "I am sorry to say it, Hazel, but you have been nothing but a disappointment." The drive back to our apartment was a blur of streetlights and silent, racking sobs. I pressed my forehead against the cold window of the car, feeling completely hollowed out. The people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had just looked me in the eye and confirmed my deepest, darkest fear: I would never be enough for them, simply because I chose to be myself. That night, Calvin held me on our cheap sofa while I cried until I could not breathe. He rubbed my back and whispered that we were going to be fine. The next morning, I woke up with my eyes swollen shut and a physical, heavy ache in my chest. Calvin had already made coffee and was sitting at our small table, looking at budget spreadsheets. Maybe we can cut the guest list, he suggested gently. Or push the date back. I shook my head. I cannot believe they actually said those things to me. Calvin reached across the table. Their loss, he said firmly. We are going to build an amazing life together, with or without their blessing. His quiet strength kept me anchored, but the pain was still gnawing at me. Against my better judgment, I felt this desperate need to call Beatrice. I thought, surely, as my sister, she would understand how cruel they had been. I waited until her lunch break and dialed her number. Hazel, this is a surprise, Beatrice answered. She sounded completely distracted. I had dinner with Mom and Dad last night to discuss our wedding plans, I said, my voice trembling. And it did not go well. Oh, she said, her voice instantly growing defensive. They mentioned you might be asking for money. The casual, dismissive way she said it felt like a knife twisting in my ribs. Our parents had already gossiped with her about me. I was not begging for a handout, I clarified quickly. I just thought they might want to contribute something, like they are for you. But they told me I do not deserve their help. There was a long pause. When she finally spoke, her words were laced with poison. Look, Hazel, you have to admit you have always done things your own way. You cannot expect the same support when you do not follow the path they laid out. I stared at the wall. So you agree with them? You think I am undeserving because I made my own choices? Do not be so dramatic, she snapped irritably. It is about family expectations. I fulfilled them. You rebelled. Actions have consequences. Expectations like marrying for money? I shot back. Do not be jealous of me because I chose the right path, Beatrice spat out angrily. Desmond and I participate in family traditions. We maintain the right connections. What have you ever done except pursue your own agenda? It was an exact echo of my mother's words. In that terrifyingly clear moment, I realized Beatrice was never going to be my ally. She loved being the golden child too much. I thought you might understand how unfair this is, I whispered. Life is not fair, Beatrice retorted. Look, I have to go. Desmond is waiting to take me to a venue tasting. She hung up. The line went dead, and with it, the last surviving thread connecting me to my family snapped. In the months leading up to Beatrice's wedding, my mother flooded a family group chat with endless updates about floral arrangements and dress fittings. Every ping on my phone was a fresh reminder of what I was denied, but I forced myself to reply with polite emojis. Then, the official bridesmaid package arrived in the mail. It included a list of mandatory expectations, attendance at 5 different pre-wedding events, a mandatory contribution to a luxury bachelorette weekend in Miami, and a link to purchase a specific bridesmaid dress that cost nearly $1,000. I looked at the number on the screen and laughed a bitter, empty laugh. We were skipping meals to save for our own modest wedding. I could not drop thousands of dollars to be a prop in her show. I called Beatrice to politely decline the bridesmaid role, offering to just attend as a regular guest. She exploded. This is so typical of you, Hazel, she screamed through the phone. Always thinking of yourself. Everyone is going to ask why my own sister is not in my wedding party. You can tell them the truth, I said calmly. I simply cannot afford the financial commitment right now. This is not about money, she yelled. This is about your attitude. You have always been jealous of me, and now you are trying to ruin my special day. No matter what I said, she refused to listen. She threatened to uninvite me entirely, but a formal invitation eventually arrived in the mail. Calvin and I debated for days whether we should even go. But we decided to hold our heads high, show up, be polite, and leave. The wedding took place on a stunning Saturday at a premier vineyard in Napa Valley. The sheer amount of money dripping from every detail was nauseating. There were massive arches of fresh orchids, a string quartet, and tables covered in fine silk. I went to the bridal suite to quickly congratulate Beatrice. She was surrounded by women in identical $1,000 gowns. She looked at me coolly, barely acknowledging my presence. Mom seated you and Calvin at table 11 with the cousins from Dad's side. I hope that is okay, she said dismissively. Table 11 was quite literally the farthest table in the room, tucked away behind a massive floral pillar near the kitchen doors. We were seated with distant relatives who did not even know my name. One elderly aunt kept asking Calvin if he was the hired photographer. During the reception, my parents walked around greeting everyone. When they reached our table, my father gave us a stiff nod. Glad you could make it, he said, sounding like a CEO greeting a low-level employee. I told my mother Beatrice looked beautiful. She gave me a sharp look and replied, she deserves it. She has always made us proud. The true breaking point came during the speeches. My father stood up, raised his crystal glass, and gave a glowing speech about the joy of watching his daughter grow into an exemplary woman. Beatrice has never taken a misstep, he declared into the microphone. Every choice has aligned with our family values. Then my mother took the microphone. She looked out over the crowd, and for a split second, her eyes locked directly onto mine. Some children follow their own rebellious path, she said clearly, her voice echoing over the speakers. But Beatrice has always understood family expectations. This wedding, which we are proud to fully support, is a testament to her character. My face burned hot with humiliation. But the absolute final straw happened 30 minutes later. I was walking toward the restrooms when I overheard my mother standing with a group of her wealthy friends. My younger daughter has never quite lived up to family expectations, my mother was saying, sighing dramatically. Such a disappointment. But what can you do? They make their choices. I stopped dead in my tracks. I turned around, found Calvin at the bar, grabbed his arm, and whispered, "We are leaving. Right now." We walked out the back doors into the dark parking lot without saying goodbye to a single soul. The drive back to our cheap hotel was completely silent. The moment Calvin unlocked the door to our room, my legs gave out. I collapsed onto the edge of the bed and broke down completely. All the years of trying, of hoping, of quietly enduring the comparisons came crashing down on me. I cannot do this anymore, I sobbed into my hands, my chest heaving. They will never see me as good enough. Nothing I accomplish will ever matter because I am not her. Calvin sat next to me, wrapping his strong arms around my shaking shoulders. He let me cry until I had absolutely no tears left. He just held me, rubbing my hair. When my breathing finally slowed down, he pulled back and looked me right in the eyes. Then maybe it is time to stop trying to earn their approval, he said softly, but with intense conviction. Maybe it is time to build a life that makes you proud, regardless of what they think. I looked at him in the dim light of the hotel room, and I knew he was right. I had spent 25 years begging for water from a dry well. That night, sitting on that awful motel bed, we made two massive decisions. First, we would postpone our own wedding plans indefinitely. The thought of standing in front of anyone and talking about family just made my stomach churn. The idea of a celebration felt incredibly hollow. Second, and most importantly, I was done. I was establishing a permanent, impenetrable boundary. No more subjecting myself to their toxic judgments and their conditional love. The next morning, the California sun was shining brightly, but I felt strangely cold and completely focused. Before we even packed our suitcases, I took out my phone. I went to my father's contact, hit block. I went to my mother's contact, hit block. I went to Beatrice's contact, hit block. I unfriended and blocked them on every single social media platform. Then, I opened my laptop and typed out a very brief, completely emotionless email. I did not hurl insults. I did not demand apologies. I simply wrote that I needed space, that I was stepping away from the family, and that I would contact them when, and if, I was ever ready. I hit send. The moment the email swooshed away into cyberspace, a bizarre physical sensation washed over me. My hands stopped shaking. The heavy, suffocating weight that had been sitting on my chest since I was a little girl suddenly lifted. Calvin and I packed our bags, drove to the airport, and flew back home to Boston. We returned to our tiny apartment, ready to focus entirely on building our future together without the massive, dark shadow of my family's disapproval hanging over us. It was, without a doubt, the most painful and terrifying decision I had ever made in my entire life. But as I unlocked our front door and walked into our quiet, safe little home, I realized it was also the most liberating. I was finally free. And little did I know, this painful break was about to set Calvin and me on a path to success that would go beyond anything I could have ever dreamed of.